Then Peter came tumbling in. "The uncle's coming behind me. Heidi must—" He could go no further. His eyes fell on the table where the sausage lay, and the sight of it so overcame him that he could not speak another word. But Heidi had already noticed who was coming and hastened to give her hand to the grandmother. The uncle never went by the hut now without stepping in to speak to the grandmother, and she was always delighted to hear his step, where he was sure to have an encouraging word for her. But today it was late for Heidi, who was out every morning with the sun. Her grandfather said the child must have her sleep, and was firm. So he only called out a good night through the open door to the grandmother, took Heidi's hand as she ran to meet him, and the two made their way beneath the twinkling stars back to the peaceful hut. And early the next morning the doctor climbed the mountain from Deerfleet in company with Peter and his goats. In a friendly spirit he tried several times to enter into conversation with the goat boy, but he did not succeed in getting more than the briefest answers to his leading questions. Peter was not so easily led into conversation. So the whole company travelled in silence up the arm, and to the hut, where Heidi already stood waiting with her two goats, all three as lively and glad as the early sunshine on the heights. "Coming too?" asked Peter, for he said this every morning, either as a question or a summons. "To be sure, of course, if the doctor will come with us," replied Heidi. Peter looked a little suspiciously at the gentleman. Then the grandfather came out, bringing the dinner bag in his hand. He first greeted the doctor with great respect, then went to Peter and hung the bag over his shoulder. It was heavier than usual, for the uncle had put in a good piece of dried meat. He thought possibly the doctor might like it up in the pasture, and would enjoy his dinner there, at the same time with the children. Peter's mouth spread almost from ear to ear, with a grin of satisfaction, for he suspected that there was something unusual inside. The journey up the mountain was now begun. Heidi was completely surrounded by the goats. Each one wanted to be next to her, and they kept pushing one another to one side. So she remained for some time in the midst of the goats, struggling with them. Then she stood still and said, "Now please run away, and don't keep coming back and pushing and shoving me. I must go with the doctor a little while now." Then she patted Schneehefer gently on the back, for she still kept close to Heidi's side and bade her especially to be very obedient. Then she made her way out of the flock and ran to the side of the doctor, who seized her hand at once and held it fast. He had no difficulty in getting Heidi to talk. She immediately began, and had so much to tell him about the goats and their remarkable doings, and about the flowers up there and the rocks and the birds, that before they knew it, they had reached the pasture. As they climbed the mountain, Peter had frequently cast sidelong glances at the doctor, which might really have terrified him, but fortunately he did not see them. When they reached the end of their journey, Heidi took her kind friend to the loveliest spot of all, where she always went, sat down on the ground and looked around. This was her favorite place. The doctor dropped down beside her on the sunny pasture ground. Round about the golden autumn sun shone over the peaks and the distant green valley. Everywhere from the pastures below came the sound of the bells of the herd, so lovely and delightful, as if announcing sweet peace far and wide. The golden sunbeams flashed sparkling and glistening here and there on the great snowfields above, and the grey Falkness lifted its towers of rock in lofty majesty far above into the deep blue sky. The morning breeze blew gently and deliciously over the mountain, and softly stirred the last bluebells still remaining from the great numbers of the summer, and cheerfully nodding their little heads in the warm sunshine. The great robber bird flew around in wide circles above, but today he did not scream. With outspread wings he floated peacefully through the blue and took his ease. Heidi gazed first one way and then another. The gay nodding flowers, the blue sky, the merry sunshine, the happy bird in the air, all were so beautiful, so beautiful. Heidi's eyes sparkled with delight. She looked at her friend to see whether he too understood how beautiful it was. Until now the doctor had been looking round him silently and wrapped in thought. As he met the child's beaming eyes, he said, "Yes, Heidi, it is beautiful here. But what do you think? If you brought a sad heart, how could you make it well so that you could enjoy all this beauty?" "Oh, oh!" exclaimed Heidi quite gaily. "Nobody ever has a sad heart here, only in Frankfurt." A smile passed over the doctor's face, but it quickly vanished. Then he added, And supposing someone should come and bring all his sorrow with him up here from Frankfurt, Heidi? Do you know of anything that could help him then? Oh, he must tell everything to the dear Lord, if he does not know what to do, said Heidi with perfect assurance. Yes. Yes, that is really a good thought, child, observed the doctor. But if what makes you so very sad and miserable comes from him, what can you say to the dear Lord? Heidi had to think what ought to be done in such a case, but she was very certain that one could obtain help from the dear Lord for every sorrow. She sought a reply from her own experience. Then you must wait, she said after a while with assurance, and keep thinking. Surely now the dear Lord knows some joy which is to come out of this by and by, so I must be still for a little and not run away from him. Then all at once it will happen, so that you will see quite clearly that the dear Lord had nothing but good in his mind all the time. But because you could not see it so that at first, and only had the terrible sorrow all the time before you, you thought it would always remain so. That is a beautiful faith, and you must hold it fast, Heidi, said the doctor. For some time he gazed silently at the mighty mountains of rock and down into the green sunlit valley. Then he continued. You see, Heidi, you might sit here with a great shade over your eyes, so that you could not take in the beauty at all about you. Then indeed your heart would be sad, doubly sad, where it is so beautiful. Can you understand that? A pain shot through Heidi's happy heart. The great shade over the eyes reminded her of the grandmother, who could never again see the bright sun and all the beauty up there. To Heidi it was a grief that always awakened as often as the fact occurred to her. She remained perfectly silent for some time, for the pain had so broken into the midst of her joy. Then she said earnestly, Yes, indeed, I can understand that. But I know something. Then you must say the grandmother's hymns, and they will give you a little light, and perhaps so much light that you will become quite happy. The grandmother said so. What hymns, Heidi? Asked the doctor. I know only the one about the sun and the beautiful garden and the verses the grandmother likes from the longer one, for I always have to read it 3 times, replied Heidi. Just tell me those verses. I should like to hear them, and the doctor sat up straight to listen attentively. Heidi folded her hands and collected her thoughts for a little while. Shall I begin where the grandmother says that trust returns to one's heart? The doctor nodded. Then Heidi began. Oh, trust his love to guide thee. He is a prince so wise, that what his hands provide thee is wondrous in thine eyes. And he, if he be willing, may bring the work about, and thus thy hopes fulfilling, dispel thy fear and doubt. It may be for a reason he will no comfort show, and for some hidden reason his light will not bestow. As if no more he heeded what sorrow was thy share, or what relief thou needed in all thy deep despair. But if thy sure faith stays thee, when thou art most perplexed, he will appear and raise thee what time thou least expectst. He will remove the burden that presses thy heart down, and thou shalt have the guerdon, and thou shalt wear the crown. Heidi stopped suddenly, for she was not sure that the doctor was still listening. He laid his hand over his eyes and was sitting motionless. She thought perhaps he had fallen asleep, so if he should wake up and care to hear more verses, she would repeat them to him. Everything was still. The doctor said nothing, but he was not asleep. He had been carried back to days of long ago. He stood as a little boy beside his dear mother's chair. She had placed her arm around his neck and was repeating the hymn which Heidi had just repeated, and which he had not heard for so long. Now he heard his mother's voice again, and saw her gentle eyes resting on him lovingly. And when the words of the hymn had ceased, the kind voice seemed to be speaking still other words to him. He must have enjoyed listening to them and have gone far back in his thoughts, for he sat there for a long time, silent and motionless, with his face buried in his hands. When he finally rose, he noticed that Heidi was looking at him in amazement. He took the child's hand in his. "Heidi, your hymn was beautiful," he said, and his voice sounded more cheerful than it had been before. "We will come up here another day, and you shall repeat it to me once more." During all this time, Peter was having enough to do in giving expression to his vexation. Heidi had not been with him up to the pasture for several days, and now that she had finally come, this old gentleman sat beside her the whole time, and Peter could not come near her at all. This greatly troubled him. He took his place at a distance higher up, where the unsuspecting gentleman could not see him, and here he first doubled up one fist and shook it, and after a while he doubled up both fists, and the longer Heidi remained sitting beside the doctor, the more madly Peter doubled up his fists, and the higher and more threateningly he raised them to the air behind the gentleman's back. Meanwhile, the sun had reached the point where it stands when it is time for the midday meal. This Peter knew well enough. Suddenly he screamed down with all his might to the others, "We must have something to eat!" Heidi arose and was going to get the bag so that the doctor would have his dinner just where he was sitting. But he said he was not hungry. He wanted nothing but a bowl of milk to drink, and then he would like to go about a little more on the mountain and climb somewhat higher. Then Heidi discovered that she was not hungry either, and that she cared for only a bowl of milk, after which she would like to take the doctor to the big moss-covered rock high up where Distelfink had almost jumped over and where all the spicy herbs grew. She ran to Peter and explained it all to him, how he must first take a bowl of milk from Schwanley for the doctor and another for herself. At first Peter looked at Heidi for some time in amazement. Then he asked, "Who's to have what's in the bag?" "You may have it, but you must get the milk first and be quick about it," was Heidi's reply. Peter had never done anything in his life so quickly as he accomplished this task, for he saw the bag constantly before him, and he did not know how its contents looked, and yet it belonged to him. As soon as the two others had drunk their milk, Peter opened the bag and took a look into it. When he saw the wonderful piece of meat, his whole body trembled with delight, and he looked into the bag again to make sure that it was really true. Then he put in his hand to take out the welcome gift and enjoy it, but suddenly he drew his hand back, as if he dared not take it. He recalled how he had stood there behind the doctor and shaken his fists at him, and now the same gentleman had given him all his splendid dinner. Then Peter was sorry for what he had done, for it seemed as if it hindered him from taking his fine present and enjoying it. Suddenly he jumped up and ran back to the place where he had been standing, stretched out his hands wide open up in the air as a sign that his clenched fists had meant nothing, and so remained standing there for some time until he felt his deed was atoned for. Then he took great leaps back to the bag, for now his conscience was clear and he could eat his unusually nice dinner with perfect enjoyment. The doctor and Heidi wandered about together for a long while and enjoyed each other's company. Then the doctor found that it was time for him to go back, and thought the child would like to stay a little longer with her goats. But Heidi had no such idea, for then the doctor would have to go alone down the whole length of the mountain. She would walk with him as far as her grandfather's hut, and even farther. She went hand in hand with her good friend, and had all the way a great deal to tell him and show him. All the places where the goats liked best to feed, and where grew the greatest number of bright yellow wild roses, and other flowers to be found in the summertime. She knew them all, for her grandfather had taught her their names. But at last the doctor said he must go. They bade each other good night, and as he went down the mountain he turned every little while to look back, and saw Heidi still standing in the same place, gazing after him, and waving her hand to him. Just so had his own dear little daughter done when he went away from his house. It was a clear, sunny autumn month. Every morning the doctor came up on the mountain, and then there was a delightful excursion farther up. Often he went off with the armuncle far up into the rocky cliffs where the old weather-beaten fir trees were. The great robber bird must have had his nest near, for he often whizzed past, whirring and croaking close to the heads of the two men. The doctor took great pleasure in his companion's society, and was more and more amazed to see how familiar the uncle was with all the plants round on his mountain, and how well he knew what they were good for, and how many valuable and good things he discovered everywhere up there, in the pitchy fir trees and the dark pines with their fragrant needles, and the crinkled moss sprouting out between the roots of the old trees, and in all the delicate little plants and modest flowers still growing quite high up in the nourishing mountain soil. The old man was equally familiar with the life and habits of all the animals up there, both great and small, and he had very amusing things to tell the doctor about the way of these little creatures living in holes in the rocks and caves and even in the branches of the lofty fir trees. The doctor did not know where the time went on these visits, and often at evening when he shook the uncle's hand heartily at parting, he would say, "My good friend, I never go away from you without having learned something new." But on many days, and usually on the finest, the doctor chose to go with Heidi. Then the two would often sit together on the lovely cliff where they sat the first day, and Heidi had to repeat her hymns and tell the doctor what she knew. And Peter would often sit behind them in his place, but he was now quite peaceable, and no longer shook his fists at them. Thus the lovely month of September came to an end. Then one morning the doctor came, looking less happy than usual. He said it was his last day, and he must go back to Frankfurt. This grieved him very much, for he had become as fond of the mountain as if it were his own home. This news pained the uncle also, for he had particularly enjoyed the doctor's company, and Heidi had become so accustomed to seeing her dear friend every day that she could not understand that the pleasure was now suddenly coming to an end. She looked up at him inquiringly and quite amazed, but it was really so. The doctor bade her grandfather farewell, and then asked if Heidi would go with him a little way. With her hand in his, she went down the mountain, but she could not fully realize that he was really going away. After a while, the doctor stood still and said that Heidi had come far enough and she must turn back. He passed his hand tenderly over the child's curly hair 2 or 3 times and said, "Now, I must go, Heidi. If only I could take you to Frankfurt and could keep you with me." All Frankfurt suddenly rose before Heidi's eyes, its many, many houses and stony streets, as well as Fraulein Rothenmeier and Tinette, and she answered somewhat timidly, "I would rather have you come back to us again." "Well, yes, perhaps it would be better. So goodbye, Heidi," said the doctor kindly, holding out his hand to her. Heidi laid hers in it and looked up at her departing friend. The kind eyes which looked down at her filled with tears. Then the doctor quickly turned and hastened down the mountain. Heidi remained standing where she was and did not stir. The beloved eyes and the tears which she had seen in them went straight to her heart. Suddenly she burst into loud weeping and rushed with all her might after the fast-disappearing doctor and called between her sobs as loudly as she could, "Doctor! Doctor!" He turned round and stood still. The child had now reached him. The tears streamed down her cheeks while she sobbed out, "I will truly go with you to Frankfurt now, and I will stay with you as long as you like, but I must hurry back to tell my grandfather." The doctor soothingly caressed the excited child. "No, no, my dear Heidi," he said in the kindest tones. "Not now. You must stay longer under the fir trees, for you might be sick again if you went with me. But come, I want to ask you something. If I am ever sick and alone, will you come to me then and stay with me? Can I think that then someone will care for me and love me?" Yes, then I will surely come to you the very same day, and I love you almost as well as my grandfather," said Heidi decidedly, still sobbing. Then the doctor pressed her hand once more and hurried on his way, but Heidi remained standing in the same spot, waving her hand again and again until the form of her friend as he hastened away was a mere speck in the distance. When he turned round for the last time and looked back at Heidi, waving her hand, and at the sunny mountain, he said softly to himself, "It is good to be on the mountain. Body and soul get well there, and life becomes happy again." Round the Alm hut the snow lay so deep that it looked as if the windows were on the level with the ground, for not a bit of the wall was to be seen below them. Moreover, the house door had completely disappeared. If the uncle had been up there, he would have had to do the same thing that Peter did every day. Every morning he had to jump out the window, and if everything was not frozen, he sank so deep in the soft snow that had fallen during the night that he had to push and struggle and kick in every direction with his hands and feet and head until he had worked his way out. Then his mother would hand him the big broom from the window, and with this Peter would push and shove the snow before him until he reached the door. Then he had great trouble, for there all the snow had to be dug away, or if it was still soft when the door opened, the whole great mass would fall into the kitchen, or else it froze up, and then they were completely walled in, for they could not make their way through these rock-like heaps of ice, and Peter was the only one who could slip through the little window. Freezing weather brought many conveniences to Peter. If he was going down to Derfley, all he had to do was to open the window, crawl through, and get out on the smooth surface of this firm snowfield. Then his mother would push his sled through the window after him, and Peter had only to seat himself on it and slide wherever he liked. In any case, he went down, for the whole arm was one great unbroken slope. The uncle was not on the arm that winter. He had kept his word. As soon as the first snow fell, he had shut up the hut and shed and gone down to Derfley with Heidi and the goats. Near the church and the parsonage stood a roomy building, which in old times had been a great mansion. This could still be seen in many places, although now the building was more or less in ruins. A brave warrior had once lived in it. He had gone to the Spanish wars and had performed many brave deeds and gained great wealth. Then he had come home to Derfley, and with his gains built a splendid house in which he intended to live. But he did not stay long. It was so tiresome to him, for he had lived too much in the noisy world to be able to be content in quiet Derfley. He went away again and never came back. After many, many years, when it was known that he was really dead, a distant relative down in the valley took the house. But it was already tumbling to pieces, and the new owner did not care to build it up again. So poor people who had to pay little for it came into the house, and if a part of the building fell, they let it lie. Since that time many years had passed. When the uncle came back with the young boy Tobias, he took the ruined house and lived in it. Since then it had stood empty most of the time, for no one without skill to stop the work of destruction to some extent, and to fill up and mend the holes and gaps, could stay there. The winter in Derfley was long and cold. The wind blew in from every side through the rooms, so that the lights were blown out and the poor people shook with cold. But the uncle knew how to manage. As soon as he had made up his mind to spend the winter in Derfley, he took the old house again, and often during the autumn came down to mend and repair it as he liked. About the middle of October he brought Heidi down. Entering the house from the rear, one came at once into an open room, of which the entire wall on one side and half on the other had fallen in. Above this, an arched window was still to be seen, but the glass had long been out of it, and thick ivy crept around it, and high up on the roof, which was, for the most part, still solid. It was beautifully arched, and one could easily see that the room had been a chapel. There being no door, one came directly into a large hall, and here in places in the floor were still handsome tiles, between which the grass grew thick. The walls were half gone, and the great pieces of the roof had given away. Had it not been for two heavy pillars, the whole roof would have been gone. As it was, it looked as if it might at any moment fall on the heads of those standing underneath. Here the uncle had put up a partition of boards, and had covered the floor thickly with hay, for in this old hall the goats had to be housed. Then there were all sorts of passageways, all half uncovered, so that the sky could be seen through, and sometimes the meadows and the road outside. But in the front, where the heavy oaken door still hung firmly on its hinges, one came to a large, spacious room, which was still in good condition. The four walls were all standing. The dark wood panels showed not a break, and in one corner stood a huge stove, reaching almost to the ceiling, and on the white tiles were big blue pictures. Some showed old castles with tall trees all around, and underneath a huntsman passing with his dogs. Another picture showed a peaceful lake, under wide-spreading oaks with a fisherman standing by it and holding his rod far out over the water.